Hello, in this video I'm going to cover the tiebreaks between Nakamura and Aronian. After two classical games being drawn, they played the tiebreaks, and in the first game Hikaru was white, and they played the Ruy Lopez, something similar to the game 1 they played in the classical portion. And here bishop b7 was played, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, everything from the game 1. Now h3, again Hikaru tries to go for the anti-martial systems to avoid the martial attack. You can check out the game 1, the recap of game 1, and now he played d3, and in the game 1 Levon played d6 with the idea to trap this bishop on b3 by knight a5 next. But in this game, in the rapid game, he played d5, sacrificing the pawn. Now Nakamura took on d5, which was principled, knight d5, and now he went for a4. He didn't take on e5 immediately. If he took on e5 immediately, then black would have knight d4, and eventually he would capture the bishop, which would lead to some unclear play with some compensation for black, because he would have the bishop pair. Let's say after knight c3 there is capture, capture, and the knight b4, for example. And I think both sides have good chances here. After bishop f4, all of white's pieces are quite active, but also on the other side black has a bishop pair, so it's quite a balanced game. There's some pressure on the long diagonal with this bishop on b7, so black has his chances as well. But Nakamura first played a4, and now Aronian plays knight d4, trying to challenge this bishop. In case of the exchange on d4, it seems like black solves all his problems, because the bishop is still very dangerous on the long diagonal, and there's no threat of capturing on e5 anymore, because now the pawn is on d4. And also here, knight e5 is very ugly for white, because after this structure is quite bad. Even though white is a pawn up, he cannot count on some advantage, because all these pawns on the queen side are quite vulnerable, especially b3 and d3. And that's why Hikaru played knight d2. Levon took on b3. Now black has the bishop pair, but now knight a5 threat is very annoying, targeting this bishop. For example, if he tries f6, knight a5 could be quite unpleasant. And if black tries to somehow get the bishop out to c8, then you can take and go knight c6, which leads to either losing a queen for rook and knight in this case, or just losing the exchange if black wants to play queen d6. But it's not only exchange, now I see, because you can put this intermediate move and after this rook a8. So I think in this case the best choice is just to give up the queen if you play bishop c8. But also you can do knight c6 first, and if queen d7, just a b5. That looks even better. But he doesn't want to play f6, because after this, just to repeat, f6, knight a5, if you go rook b8, now there is ab, and taking, and d4, using the pressure on this pawn to activate the knight. If you don't do anything as black, then you lose the pawn. If you take it, then after this the knight can go to c6 or e6, which is quite unpleasant. So black doesn't play f6, he plays knight b4. And now the difference is that after knight a5 there's bishop f3, and black uses the pressure on the c2 pawn to double white's pawns on the king side, and now white's structure on the king side is quite compromised. So Hikaru doesn't do that, he takes on e5 now. Queen d5 by Levon, and now f3 trying to cover g2, bishop d6, and now d4. And here black had maybe an option to play c5 to somehow challenge the center and to destabilize the knight on e5. But he played rook a e8, which led to ab, and now bishop d2. Trying to counter attack on e5 by attacking the knight on b4. Now black went back to c6, but now bishop f4, supporting this knight on e5. And what black dreams of is to play f6. But in this case it's not ideal, because you can take on c6, and it's not possible to capture on f4 because there's this fork, and black is just an exchange down after this. And after knight c6, black is forced to exchange some pieces. After bishop c6, he can take, let's say, cd and queen d2, and this pressure is not so dangerous, I would say. White is going to exchange one pair of rooks, or just use the e-file for his good, and black's compensation is very questionable in this case. So now king h8 was played by black. Now he tries to play f6 next, because now there's no fork on e7 after knight c6, knight e7, like in the previous case. And now Hikaru plays bishop h2, trying to meet f6 by knight c6 and exchanging. Let's say if f6 now, then you can take, and after bishop h2, king h2, bishop c6, we have something similar like in the previous case. White is a pawn up, and this pressure again is not so dangerous anymore because it just hits on f3. So after this, black chose to get the pawn back. Yeah, also I forgot to mention that here, instead of bishop h2, maybe it's better to go queen d2 to defend the bishop, and now to meet f6 by knight c6, and again exchanging the bishops. And I think white is doing very well in that case. So after this, bishop h2 was played, and this allowed black to capture on e5, and we had plenty of exchanges now. And now Hikaru plays queen d4, trying to force the queen trade after this to force black somehow to push either c6 or b4 to compromise his pawns on the queen side. If he plays c6, then probably there is rook a7 and some knight b3, knight c5 in the next couple of moves, and the bishop is quite bad on b7. So that's why Aronian plays queen g5 and tries to avoid the queen trade, but there is queen c5 continuing to harass the queen. Now white also attacks the rook and the pawn on b5, so black has to capture, and bishop d5. Now black's dream is to make some fortress by c6 and to somehow activate the rook. Maybe to go to e8, or if white allows, to go to a8 to get some counterplay against these pawns on the queen side. Now Hikaru plays rook a7 and now c6. Knight d3, trying to challenge this bishop by either knight f4 or knight b4. g6 by black, and now rook c7. Before knight b4 happens, to go rook c7 to attack on c6. But this allows black to go rook a8. At least getting some counterplay in return. Knight b4, and now king g7. Probably here was better to give a check, and on king f2 to go rook c1 to attack the c2 pawn. And now in case of this, now the f7 pawn is not for free because c2 pawn is also under attack. And if let's say king e3, then king g7. Sorry. This one, and if king e3, king g7, now also you have ideas like rook g1 in the next couple of moves if the king gets too close to the d pawn. And basically you have the race. White is going to collect some pawns on the queen side, black is going to collect the same on the king side and start pushing his king side pawns. And it's quite unclear if white can capitalize on this. But he chose king g7 and this allowed white to capture the pawn. Rook d8 now, and now g4. This was quite strange for Hikaru to play a move like this, which allowed rook d2. This allowed this, and the king is just cut off. It was best to go something like b4. And in case of rook getting to the second rank, there is rook c5. And let's say if h4, if h5, then c3. First to force this, and now h4. And then the king gets closer, gets to h2, g3, f4, and white can probably afford to lose the g2 pawn, because in that case he would win the b5 pawn. So let's say if black plays f6, there's king h2. Let's make some moves. King e6, king f4, and now if black waits, if he doesn't capture on g2, if he keeps attacking the c3 pawn, there is g4 next. If let's say king f7, there's g4, takes, and the h pawn is going to become a passed pawn. And in that case, black's life is much tougher. But also, if you take on g2, now white takes on b5, let's say rook c2, rook b6, king e7, rook c6, and if rook h2, just go back. If he goes back to b2 to somehow stop these pawns, white can play f4 and slowly improve his king's position, and yeah, maybe even go for something like rook c5 in the next couple of moves to slowly push b5, c4, and go on and on. And I think white is close to winning here. But Hikaru played g4, allowed this move, and now the king cannot escape like this, like in the previous case. Now Hikaru tried h4, but now Levon plays h5. Hikaru took, and now b4. Now this allowed rook d4, double attack on these two pawns, c3, and now he took on h4. And probably something that Hikaru missed was that after rook c5, black just has king g6, and in case of capturing, there's rook c4. And actually, white cannot defend the pawn by rook c5 because this is just a draw. After rook c5, king c5, bc5, king f5. Now the king has to collect the h pawn, but first white needs to somehow make it tougher for black to force him to get the longer route to capture these two pawns. But even that longer route is not enough for white to capitalize on this. In the end, black is going to capture the f3 pawn once he takes on f7, king e3, and the f pawn is lost. And I think that's something that Hikaru mentioned in the interview that he missed, that this pawn endgame is just a draw, that he's not able to capture on b5 because of this. And now either you're going to play rook c5 and defend the pawn but enter the pawn endgame, or you're just going to lose the pawn on c3 and have this passed pawn as black. So he played king g2, rook f4 by black, and now king g3. Rook f5, f4, and now black uses the h-pawn as a decoy to play h4. And now if you try to avoid by king g4, there's h3. And actually it's not possible to capture because h2 is killing white. The rook cannot stop the pawn, and that's just it. If you don't do it, if you try somehow to defend the pawn to somehow stop the pawn by your rook, I think just h2 and after rook a1, rook f6, and at least you get some counterplay against the c3 pawn. So this was not acceptable to Hikaru. He took on h4, rook f4, and now king g5. Now Levon tried to attack the c3 pawn by rook f3, king g4 by white, and now rook d3. I would say slightly inaccurate. I think here it was much more precise to go rook f6. And now of course white cannot capture because he's lost in that case. The f-pawn is going to be a decoy while king just swoops in and collects these pawns. He can go to c5, but I think after rook b6 black has a pretty comfortable defense. After, let's say, king f5, rook b8, black can just shuffle on the b file. If the king gets too close to the pawn, then you can start playing king g6, f5, and start pushing the f-pawn. And eventually, if you exchange rooks, in that case the f-pawn is going to be too fast. But he went for this kind of defense, rook c5 by white, and now it's becoming tougher because white's king is going to slowly get closer to the c3 pawn to defend it and then to collect on b5. But of course black has the f-pawn as a counterplay and he has some chances. Black went for king f6, king f4, king e6, king e4, and now rook d8. And this was a bad move. Actually here rook h3 was better. And the reason why is that by rook h3 you are just forcing black to get the king further from the f-pawn. Now black gives a check, he can go here, give one check more, king b3, and now start pushing the pawn. And now the difference is that after this, f4, rook b8, king e7 can be played. And now white cannot defend from this side, which he would very much like. If he tries from the other side, like this way, let's say rook a8, then black just pushes the pawn. Rook a1, f2, and with only two pawns and the king, black will be able to stop these pawns without the help of the rook. Because anytime that white pushes the pawns, then black's rook is going to be able to give some check and to collect one of these pawns. But he went back to d8, rook takes b5, and now rook d1. Rook b6 check, king d7, and now rook f6, king e7, and rook f3. Now he tries to stabilize and to somehow start pushing the pawn. And also, he tries to go rook d3 and get the king on the queen side to support his pawns, to push them. King e6 by black, and now rook d3. Finally, white makes a bridge. f5, and now king d4. Now the idea is very simple, to sacrifice the pawn as late as possible until these pawns are enough advanced. Rook b1 by black, and now rook e3 check here, and now rook e8. He tries to control from behind. f4, and now rook b8. Seemed a bit strange. Seemed like a loss of time, I think. Here it was better to go rook f8 immediately, and after king g5 to go king c5. And let's say if black tries to push the pawn by king g4, b5, f3, c4, king g3, now king b6 is very strong. And after f2, then the c pawn is going to run. In case of this, just give up the rook and go c6. And now there's no way that black can stop the pawn. It's impossible. So that's why rook f8 was much more efficient. But he went for this. King f5, b5, and now f3. And now also rook f8 was winning for white. And the point was that after this, there's king e4. A brilliant move. And now the difference is that after rook e1, king d5, now the king is on d5, much closer to c6 and supporting this pawn. In the previous line it was even quicker. Comparing to the previous line, it was much quicker, one tempo quicker. And in case of rook b1, then there's c4, king g3, and now king c6. If you push, b6 takes, and now c5. And now the black's king is not on time, because after king b7, king e5, c6, there's no stopping this pawn. And I just want to show you the difference. After rook f8, king g4, also c4 looks very logical, but actually it doesn't work. Because after king g3, king c5, f2, b6 and queen, king c6, now there is rook c1, and after c5, now the king is one tempo quicker. After this, king d5, and on king d7 there's this move, and it's actually a draw. So let's go back to the game. In the game, what happened was that Hikaru played king e3, rook b3 by Levon, and now you don't take on f3, because after capturing king e2, king e6, black's king is too close to the pawn, and it's a draw. So after this, he tried to hold on to this c pawn, king g4, king c2 by white, and now the final mistake, Levon played f2. Basically here black has two moves, rook a3 or f2, and it's a very small choice, but a very tough one. Rook a3 was much better, also a draw, because in case of rook f8 to stop the pawn, there's king g3. And now if you go b6, the b pawn becomes disattached. Let's say after b6 you just go rook a6, I suppose. Or no, just rook a2. Because if you go rook a6 immediately, then b7 is quite strong. You need to give a check first on a2. And somehow to try to force the king to get to the b file. Let's say if king b3, rook a6, now the b7 is not able, it's not possible to play because you can just collect the b pawn. If he goes to d3, then you can play rook b2 and stop this b pawn, because after rook f6 there's f2, and on the next move you're going to capture on b6. So that's quite good. And this is why this is a draw. Also, here after c4, there's f2, and let's say on b6, there's this. You make a bridge as black. And now if you take b7, queens, and you take on c4, and this is a draw, of course. And that's why this is a draw, but f2 was played. And now rook f8 by Nakamura. He's going to collect on f2. If rook a3 to have these tricks. You just play king b2. And you take on f2 next. And here rook b5 was played, rook f2, and I think in this position Levon Aronian flagged. He lost on time. But it doesn't matter because black's king is so cut off that it's not possible to survive this position. White is going to simply push the pawn until the c7 square and just win the game. So that's how the first game ended, after a couple of twists and turns. Let's go to the second one. In the second game, Aronian needs a win, and he is white now. Okay, now we have e4. e5, and we have the Italian once again, like in the game 2. Bishop c5, castles, knight f6, rook e1, and now d6. Nakamura stays faithful to his setup with bishop on c5, and also after c3 he plays a6, not a5. And now Levon plays early d4. Plays aggressively, and now bishop a7. And now to keep the center solid, to not allow bishop g4, he plays h3. Nakamura castles, and now bishop e3. And in this position, black plays h6. Trying to prepare rook e8, because if you don't play h6, you allow knight g5 maybe after rook e8. So h6 is played because of that. Also here, knight e4 seems interesting, but after d5, knight a5 has to be played, because after bishop e3 there is rook e3, and now both knights are under attack and black just loses the piece. So here knight a5 is pretty much forced. After bishop a7, black can take on c4, and it becomes quite messy. After this, knight b2 is possible, queen d2, bishop f5, and if rook e2, then there's knight c4, and eventually you cannot attack the knight on c4 and just go rook a7 next. If you play rook b4, then there is knight d3, but I don't know what is this. After bishop e3, you can capture on b4, capture, and black got 2 pawns, but white has some pieces. White has some minor pieces, and it's quite good for him, I think. But let's go back to the game. h6 was played in the game. Bishop b3. And this time knight e4 doesn't work, because now after d5 you're just losing the pieces. Black takes, and now both knights are under attack. So after this, rook e8 was played, trying to pressure on e4. Knight d2, and now bishop d7. Nakamura doesn't dare to capture on d4. Here, after cd, to capture on e4, because maybe after this bishop c2, then there's queen d3, and provoking f5 seems a bit sketchy to black, I guess. It doesn't feel very solid. And also there is some idea like g4 followed by g5, and trying to get some space on the king side. Nakamura tries to play more solid and plays bishop d7. In a must-draw situation, it's quite reasonable not to take many risks. And now queen b1 by Levon. He tries to defend the e4 pawn in case of some trade on d4. Queen e7 by Nakamura, and now a3 by Levon. Queen f8. Still, black doesn't want to exchange on d4, even though here it was possible after, let's say, capturing. Bishop d4. Bishop e6 looks quite nice. But never mind, let's go to the game. Queen f8 was played. Now Levon plays queen d3. And now b5 by black. Rook ac1. I think here maybe he was trying to get c4 to open up, to use this knight on c6 as a target. That's why Nakamura played this, and now bishop a2. Here, again, c4 seems a bit unpleasant to meet. Also, it looks like b4 is coming next. Also, d5 looks quite interesting, so c5 was played by Nakamura. And now in case of d5, I think you can just play c4 and get the knight to c5 later on. And it looks like black is doing fine here. So that's why Levon tries to keep the tension by playing b3. Knight goes back to c6, and now he goes to play d5. Knight goes to e7, and now c4. Now in case this happens, white has a quite pleasant choice to capture either with the knight to target d6, or just to capture with the pawn to play against these stupid bishops on a7 and d7. Although his bishop on a2 is not much better. So that's why Hikaru tries to keep it tense and goes for knight g6. And now it's time to do something on the queen side. Capturing on b5 doesn't do much, because after ab, the a3 pawn becomes a target. So that's why he tries with this move, b4, and now lots of pawn trades are going to happen. First, cb was played, ab, and now bc4. Here it was interesting to first capture on e3, and if queen takes, to go a5 and to exchange all the pawns on the queen side, which in my opinion would solve all the problems for black. But black played this, bishop c4, and now we have trade on e3, rook e3 to keep attacking on a6. But now the b4 pawn becomes the target, and black plays this, queen a3, and now queen d8, trying to get queen b6 next, to hit on b4, bishop f1, and now bishop b5. The plan is simple, just to trade the bad bishop for a good one on f1, which is attacking the a6. And now maybe a better choice was to go knight c4 and at some point to get to a5 and c6 once the bishops get traded. But here Levon played queen a5, which simplified the game even more, and now we had this, queen d8, rook d8, king f1, and now again the b4 pawn becomes a real target. Levon plays rook b3, and now rook b5. I think here the chance was missed to play just a5 and to liquidate all the pawns. Because if white captures, then there's this, and knight e4, and the d5 pawn becomes a weakness. And white cannot really push the pawn so easily without making it weak. The knights are just going to be there and attack the pawn. And if b5 happened, then a4, and you can use the a pawn as a decoy to capture the b5 pawn. And once you exchange these pawns, I think it's going to become much easier for black to equalize. But he went for this, trying to put some pressure along the b file. Now knight e1, which is very clever, trying to get the knight to d3 and to defend the pawn. Now knight e8, knight d3, and now f5, trying to break this pawn chain. That's why Levon plays f3, trying to keep it very solid. Now black took, and knight f4 by black, trying to destabilize the b4 pawn by exchanging this very good knight. Now he took on f4, took, and now king goes closer, tries to get to f3, rook ab8, rook cb1, defending, knight f6, and now king f3, trying to get g5 to provoke g5. For example, if you go to d3, you don't threaten anything, and knight d7 is quite strong, getting to e5 next. And unfortunately knight c4 doesn't work, because after knight c5 black wins the exchange. So he goes here, g5, and now knight c4. attacks d6. And now Hikaru played rook knight e8. For example, if he played a5, which seems very counterintuitive, you cannot capture with the pawn because the rook hangs. If you capture with the knight, then there is rook e8. And the e4 pawn becomes an easy target. You cannot do rook e1 because just capture on d5 and the b4 pawn becomes very loose. If you try knight c4 again, knight e4 can be played, and there's no rook e1 to make a pin because of this. Knight d2. And the rook on e1 is loose, so that's the end. But he chose to be more passive and he went for this. And here it was chance for Levon to take over. He played h4, trying to undermine these pawns on the king side, but this was time for king e2 to get closer to this side, to use the fact that the knight on e8 is passive. And to get king d3, king c3, to defend the pawn and then to free the rooks, to be able to put pressure on a6. And in case of a5, with the same idea I showed you before, if he captures knight f6, then there's this. And after rook e8, there's king c4. And in case of this, to go rook e1. And actually I think the b pawn becomes quite a nice asset for white. If you trade rooks, let's say in this case, knight c6, the b pawn starts marching, and I think this is quite dangerous for black. This was a chance for Levon to make it much tougher for Hikaru. But he chose h4. Now black has enough time to generate some counterplay by rook c8, knight a5, and now knight f6 back. Since there's no pressure on d6, now the knight can come back, hg, hg, and now knight c6. Trying some tricks. Now rook e8, stopping the trick and also attacking the e4 pawn. And now knight d4 by Levon, hitting the rook on b5 and trying to go knight e6 on the next move. But now Hikaru finds a very clever move. He plays g4. Now he's forcing the king to get to f4, and now he takes on e4. And again we have massive trades. Takes king f6, and after this black is a pawn up. And it's virtually impossible to win this game, but Levon tries. Rook f1, rook h5, and now white can play king g6, but I don't see how white is going to play later on. Black can just play rook g5 check, and I don't find white's position particularly nice. But instead Levon played even a worse move. He played rook f4, trying to hit the g4 pawn, and now it becomes a forced line. Rook h6, king e7, and rook b7. And after king d8 you can pause the video to find the right move. In this position, Nakamura played rook h8, after which Levon resigned, because on the next move black is going to play either king g7 or king h7, depending on where the rook is. If you give a check, then you can even do king f7. For example, if king c8, then you just go to g7 and get king h7 next. And yeah, this is how Nakamura won the Grand Prix after winning the Group A, winning against Richard Rapport, and in the finals he beat Levon in tiebreaks after 2 rapid games. Thank you so much for watching and see you soon. Bye.